So I've been having a discussion with an individual. It started off on a lot of different things, mostly, I guess, what you could call systemic racism and whatnot. But now we've gotten to the point where, and I've had this discussion a lot. It's just right now it seems like I feel like I want to articulate it on video, so audio at least. So the socialists, a lot of socialists and communists and whatnot claim that, capitalism is, well, this person just said that capitalism is a bigger problem than government. And I would think that even an anarcho-communist would at least say that I would think that they would at least say that they're equally the problem. And I would agree depending on what they mean by capitalism. I wouldn't agree by what I consider capitalism to be, but I guess that kind of pertains to what they mean by socialism too. I wouldn't necessarily think that socialism is a problem depending on what you mean, but most people mean like a type of Marxist view. And I know that an anarcho-communist does not subscribe to a Marxist view of at least political agenda. But if you literally mean voluntary collectivism, then obviously as an anarchist, there's no problem with that. So, but what I'm saying here is that, okay, so the issue that they put forth a lot of the time anyway, the socialists and democratic socialists and the people who believe in government, who consider themselves anti-capitalist or socialist leaning, they try to point, they say the capitalists are the problem. The capitalists are manipulating the state. And if the state were just controlled by the workers, obviously is the most basic and blatant way that they put it. If the state were controlled by the workers, it would be better because, most of us are workers. So majority interests would ring through the state, and this whole agenda of trying to make things equal economically would shine through, allegedly. Obviously, I think that shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what a state is. And that's what I'm trying to explain here is that my point is that it's fundamentally irrelevant who, in quote here, who is controlling the state, because the problem is the state is a violent monopoly regardless of who's controlling it. That is what a state is as a concept itself. That's the fundamental basis of the idea. So no matter how noble your intentions are, as Marx even said, the state is a tool for one class to oppress another. Yeah, but that's why that's true. But the issue is that it doesn't matter what class it is that's oppressing another. There will be class versus class oppression. And now a communist have said to me, well, I don't care about oppressing the capitalist class. But, this is a dangerous way of thinking because it's still groupthink. It's this floating abstraction of the capitalist class based on some or another definitions. It's not concrete enough to, I'm sure they think it is, but it's not concrete enough to say something like that and, not imply probably violence against innocent people, because like petty bourgeois, even though they say they're sympathetic to it, they want to make it in some sense an irrelevant job. So even at that point, they could think that petty bourgeois should be stopped and oppressed. So you're going to do, they will be doing violence to people who are trying to start businesses, basically by definition. And, they don't imagine that it's violence, or that if they do, they, like that one individual said to me, they don't care because they view the capitalists to be in the process of oppressing people. But that's not necessarily the case, like a capitalist can be an oppressor, but a capitalist in a market economy is not inherently an oppressor. A socialist tends to think that they are, though, just due to the nature of of their view of property, which a lot of points I agree with on the way that they argue against what I would say most people consider property. But the problem is that they also take it as a given that is legitimate property, such as just claiming open fields and preventing people from going in there and never doing anything to them, just to try to raise property rates. And then you try to sell off a piece of land that nobody's labored on. You're being scammed if you're buying a piece of land that nobody's ever touched. That guy obviously doesn't own that land, even by Lockean principles. So, but it's fundamentally irrelevant who's controlling the state, because the state is necessarily oppressive. And that's what the Marxists, it seems that the Marxists don't understand. And the same thing with the more general statist, the more common type of either, a quote moderate statist, if there is such a thing, somebody who's doesn't consider himself far left, definitely doesn't consider himself an anarchist, but considers himself anti-capitalist and believes that the state should be used in some way. So technically, that's kind of a Marxist perspective in a sense, at least if you take the propositions of the Communist Manifesto, because those those were like kind of a specific writing that he envisioned for a specific situation. It wasn't necessarily the entirety of his philosophy. So, but based on that, you could kind of call that a Marxist perspective that the state should be used in a quote egalitarian sense. But the problem that the Marxists and people who believe in government don't understand is that it's logically impossible, because the state is necessarily oppressive. It cannot be used in an egalitarian sense, because you will always have, by definition, you are creating a state, a group that is viewed to have more rights than everyone else, a group that is perceived to be authority, a group that has the right to rule everyone, basically. So you're necessarily creating an antagonistic situation. And that's just kind of the point I'm saying here. Like I asked, were capitalists the problem in the Soviet Union? And, he says, I can't speak for the Soviet Union. But it's like, I mean, you kind of can. You can analyze philosophy. I'm sure these people speak for Nazis all the time, speak about Nazi Germany all the time, and he wasn't there either. And we've got probably just as much empirical data and philosophy and historical analysis on either of those. So maybe more for one or the other. But I'm fairly certain that it's pretty common knowledge at this point. If you want to actually go look for it, you'll find it. But so my answer, obviously, no, it wasn't capitalists that was the problem with the Soviet Union. The problem with the Soviet Union, that was the belief in a totalitarian government, and that is, and technically government is always, quote, totalitarian. Democracy is a facade. I can get into that in other videos, but a monopoly on force cannot be but totalitarian. It cannot be but a dictatorship. It cannot be but oppressive. It's self-imposed either by the king and his lackeys, or the totalitarian dictator, military dictator, or the 51% of voters forcing themselves on everyone else through some representative or even directly. So that the problem here is the collective, the involuntary collectivist concept of government itself. The problem is not who is controlling the involuntary collectivist government concept of the state. The problem is that the state itself is an inherently violent institution. And that's where I would think that even an anarcho-communist could see the logic here. The logic's right there for you. Fundamentally, who controls the state is the distraction. He says the state is the distraction, the capitalists are the problem, because the capitalists use the state to control everyone. But no. The problem is that the belief in the state is what allows the, quote, capitalist or the military dictator or the democratically elected dictator or whatever, you want to call it, or Stalin or Hitler. That is the problem that lets people get away with that, because the subject class, the ruled, the victims of the state, they believe that it's different. Like, and I always put the example, like, imagine if Bill Gates or some other capitalist who you think is evil or whoever created a system of schools, started building schools, and then said everybody has to pay for it because you benefit from me starting this school up. And so everybody has to pay. How is that any different? Suddenly he's, that obviously everybody would realize that is illegitimate, is the point of that. The belief is the problem. The belief in the state is the problem, because they believe the state is authority and has the ability through legislation to alter what actions are moral and acceptable, and actually alter them in physical reality. Because if 51%, this is a modern democracy context, let's just say if 51% decided that that's okay for Bill Gates to do it, then suddenly he's a politician, and suddenly he's proposing legislation, and it's somehow different that he's just building schools and forcing everyone to pay for them, which is exactly what the so-called public education system is. It's just one group, in context, 51% of the people decided to force 49% of the people to pay for a school that they wanted because they, quote, benefit. It's no different. The only difference is this illusory step of the vote. The vote doesn't matter. If you vote and lose and you're still outnumbered, they're still going to force themselves on you and do it. The vote does not matter, and that's where, in the same sense, it's like democracy is just a gang of dictators. It's not fundamentally different than a monarchy or a military dictatorship or what have you, because all states are fundamentally dictatorships, are fundamentally involuntary, oppressive monopolies on force, are fundamentally a tool for one class to oppress another, and so forth. So it's not. The problem is not who is controlling the state. The problem is not capitalism or the desire for material resources. The problem is the belief that in one's attempt to gather material resources, they have the right to rule other people and to take their material resources and then either create so-called public schools or give corporate subsidies out to certain firms and not others. So the problem is not who is controlling the state. The problem is the state, because without the belief in the state, people would be shooting Bill Gates, quote, tax collectors, because they recognize it's illegitimate for Bill Gates to force you to pay for a school that you don't want or use. The problem is that people think it is somehow different if 51% of the people choose Bill Gates to force everyone to pay for a school that they don't want or use. That is the fundamental problem. It's not who is controlling the state. It's the problem that the state is the belief that a group of people can alter morality, basically, and can change the same action from being moral to immoral, or can somehow have authority that no one had authority to do to begin with. Like, nobody would say, yeah, Bill Gates has the right to build schools and force us to pay for them. But they would say, well, the people can, and neither does Joe, and neither does Steve, and neither does Nancy, and neither does Claire, and so on. But suddenly, if Joe, Steve, Nancy, and Claire all get together and choose Bill Gates to do something that they don't have the right to do, now Bill Gates has the right to do it, and he's a politician, and he's making legislation. They elected Bill Gates to do this, and one of the things that maybe he should do is force everyone to pay for school so we're not stupid. And it's just like, well, you're kind of you're already going into there with a delusional belief that political ritual, writing names down, pressing magic buttons, not who is controlling the state.